So in a discussion about influence or leadership, authority, psychologists will often, there's a couple lines of research that are quite common. One are influence studies, or you can think of like the Zimbardo prison study where they placed people in these roles as prison guards or prisoners, or Stanley Milgram's shock study where somebody was a teacher and then there was a learner they were applying shocks to. And they're often looking to see, in certain settings, social settings, what causes people to follow authority figures. Or they might study, so that's one line of research. The other is they'll often study business leaders, right? Or generals or famous coaches. And they'll try to see what qualities, what traits. So remember, we've talked before, psychologists are often looking for traits, these sort of enduring personality qualities that they think like, okay, if we can isolate the traits of a good military leader or a good business leader, maybe we can identify them, and to some degree maybe those will be teachable to others, or we might be able to predict future leaders if they have these traits. And so the text will look at a variety of different kinds of studies about how leaders are studied, about how influence is studied, often with the purpose of then being able to identify more of it or increase the ability of influence and leadership that you have. Now, sociologists often study influence in a pretty different way. And for this, I want to dive into a theory of voluntary action that was postulated by Max Weber many, many years ago. And so Weber has 4 types of voluntary action. So the emphasis here is less on the influence of the leader and on why the individual in that social setting finds the authority figure to be a legitimate authority to follow. Now, we're not talking about coercive action. This is voluntary social action. So if somebody puts a gun to your head and tells you to do something, you're very likely to comply. But that would be coercive influence. And that's outside of what Weber is trying to explore here. So why do people voluntarily choose certain paths of social action? And he has 4 main types. And really there's 2 categories, rational and non-rational. And then those are subdivided. So take a look at this chart. So let's talk about the 2 that are non-rational. So when I say rational, it means there's a kind of goal. People are doing it for some kind of reward. But even that is broken into 2 types of rationality. But these are the non-rational ways in which people recognize a legitimate authority figure and voluntarily, comply. One is traditional action. So maybe a family ritual or something like that. They participate in something because that is just the way it's always been, and they perceive it as a legitimate thing that they should continue to do. And so, customs, habits, think of holiday traditions. Why do you put a tree in your house? Why do you comply with that behavior? Nobody put a gun to your head to do it, right? And it costs you money and it's a hassle. But it's a long-standing custom, and often we do comply with social action simply because it's a tradition. The second type of non-rational voluntary action is affective, and the affect are the emotions, right? So things that you are just passionate about, right? So maybe it's you comply at a concert with a certain kind of dancing or behavior because you're really excited about it, and the collective effervescence of being part of the crowd. Maybe you're in love with someone, and so you just choose these voluntary actions. And it's not because there's some big leader over you, but you're in love with them, so you want to do these actions for them. Artistic expression could be the same way. So anything that's driven by the emotion, by passion. Now let's switch to the rational forms of voluntary social action. So we'll start with the basic one, really, and that is an instrumental rational action. You're doing something because there is a reward. You will get more money. You will get more status. You will get, if you're an animal, more food or mating opportunities. But these are the most basic kinds of instrumental action because there's a reward. And at its core, you study economics and they talk about rational, decision making. And when they say rational, they mean that you're weighing the risks and the rewards. right? The costs and the benefits of why you do something. And if you think that there is a greater reward, then you do it. And often that, that's emphasizing the ends over the means. In some cases, that might be a critique of somebody who is hyper-oriented towards instrumental rational action. But nevertheless, many of our choices in life we do because there's a bigger payout, right? Why do you pick this major versus that major? Well, some students might pick a certain major for tradition. Maybe it's the major their parents and grandparents and ancestors picked, and that's what they do. Others for passion or the affect. They're just really excited about that kind of content. They want to learn it. But some are like, hey, this major will get me a higher paying job. Well, that would be a great example of choosing that voluntary social action for instrumentally rational reasons. And then the more nuanced form of rational action is not instrumental, but is value rational. So that's something that connects with your identity. You're still doing it for a reward, but it's much more of a intangible reward, right? So maybe it's religious practices that you participate in because it's very connected to your sense of identity. And you want to think of yourself as a good Muslim or Mormon or whatever. And so you do that thing. You go on the pilgrimage because it's a part of your identity and story and narrative. And so, or you go on your Mormon mission because even though it costs you something, it will have this payoff in your sense of self. Right. And so it's value rational. You do get a reward. Maybe the reward is an afterlife, heaven, even though that's not material or tangible now. Or it's just a boost to your sense of self, your identity. And that's a little different than just doing something purely for emotion or passion. It's connected to the kind of status and self-narrative of who we are. And that can be a very powerful form of reward. So I highlight this to say, while there's a lot of value in some of the influence studies and leadership studies that psychologists often do, and even though Max Weber created these 4 categories of voluntary social action a long time ago, they're still very relevant. And we still often use them as a way of categorizing human action.